So thanks everyone. Here we are at the DS Incubator today on a meetup about the package Pins, which we covered some time ago, but Pins has changed the interface, or at least added a new interface since Pins number 1. The old interface became a legacy interface. I think we are discouraged to use it because they say that they're going to maintain it and keep it alive, but want to updates or improvements to it. So they're pushing for the new interface. So that's one reason to talk about Pins today. But another reason is more practical and related to the work that I'm doing with the PassTags project. And so I wanted to use this space to share the idea of Pins in general, to talk about the new interface, but also to present one potential way in which I could distribute a continuously evolving data set in a way that analysts can use, so they can use different versions of the data and not break new code. So the fear here is that if I change the data set in some way, by adding a column, by renaming a column, maybe their old code dies, breaks. So there is a number of ways in which we could, create a release. What do we call it? A release framework, a release. But Pins is one way in which we haven't or we haven't kind of discussed. So I would like to present it as one potential solution to providing a release plan. Monica, I hear you say something, or I read you say something that you're asking if you missed something about a joke, or about about a joke that someone wrote and I missed, or something about what I'm trying to explain.
No, it's about a joke. I feel like I'm missing something.
I find Jackson's jokes very confusing sometimes. I just laugh because he's funny, but so I pretend I know what he's talking about. Okay, so here we are talking about Pins, and the idea is mainly is a very narrow, specific use case. Is the idea of sharing different versions of an evolving data set as Pins, which are basically our objects, and using Dropbox as one online platform. I don't particularly like Dropbox in general, but it is a tool that for this case could be useful in the team where I'm working with PassTags. It's very much used, so it could be used with minimal kind of overhead. Everyone knows the tool. And it plays really well with the idea of local boards, of folder boards with Pins. As I already said, I already mentioned the idea that Pins has changed the interface. So basically the objectives of the meetup are going to be learning about the idea from the perspective of an idea analyst, someone who needs to just read data that I, for example, publish on Dropbox. So I'm not going to be focusing so much on the publishing side of things. So that is what in my head is kind of part 2 of this meetup, and it's one part that is not confirmed. So if we have time, I'm going to show very briefly how I published the Pins that I'm going to be using today for the example. But if we don't have time, I'm good with just showing here, leaving a record of how an analyst could use this idea of Pins to inject in their analysis different versions of data sets that I'm delivering to them. So thus the audience is, of course, analysts from 2DI, but also people from anywhere that might find this idea useful. And I already said why this is important, because sometimes if you use new data with old code, things break basically. The specific things we're going to be doing today is read the latest version of a specific Pin. List all the Pins that are available in the board, and I have, for example, published somewhere. Explore the available versions of one specific Pin. So you may publish different objects, but for each object you may have different versions, and you may want to explore that. And by exploring, I mean trying to read, for example, what is the description of the version of the dataset versus another one. So explore the different metadata of a specific Pin. And then once you find the version that you want, how you actually go about reading that specific version. And as I said, if we have time, we may see how I publish the Pins on Dropbox. So that's it. So let me jump to Well, let me, as usual, I'm gonna walk you through the structure of a DS incubator series. Generally, this is a GitHub repository somewhere on the 2degrees organization. In this case, it's ds.pins, and each meetup is hosted inside a folder. In this case, number 1 intro, and what you're gonna read here on screen is the same that you can see here on my RStudio viewer panel. So I'm gonna be walking through this document. Again, someone, pretend me, develops a data set and they publish it to a folder in Dropbox, and you, say, an analyst, have access to that Dropbox folder, and it is in sync with your local computer. So you have a copy in your computer of that Dropbox folder that lives online. So I think we are all familiar with that framework, so I won't spend much time on that. But then what I'm going to be doing first is the setup. Setting this up is fairly straightforward. You just use the package pins, so library pins. So this is maybe a clarification I should do. I mean, this specific framework for distributing data is one where I have in my head, the idea of an analyst that uses R. Right, and so there may be other ways to distribute the data, even in Dropbox too, but this meetup is focused for those who actually choose to use R. Then I'm gonna also be using other packages, all the packages that come in the tidyverse, because they're convenient for some manipulations that I'm gonna be doing later on. You don't have to use the tidyverse, but I like it, so I do. Also, I'm gonna be using the here package, which, as we saw in the last series, is very useful to create paths that can be ported to different computers. So basically, this project works in my computer and should also work just the same in your computer too. Also, I'm going to be sourcing a function that I created to basically create a path inside this specific to create a path to the Dropbox folder, to the copy of the Dropbox folder that I have in my computer, and the name of the file that contains that function is this, so pins_path, and it lives in the R folder of this specific project that I'm showing to you. So now if I use that function pins path, what you could see is something that might look familiar to those who work in 2 degrees, which is this very horrible path to anything that we put inside Dropbox. And I say horrible because it contains things that are generally very ill-advised for paths, like spaces and symbols, like the 2 degrees symbol. Unfortunately, that's something that we cannot do a lot about without at least a huge effort. So we just live with that. So this function pins path is something that I could build as well for the analysts working in our team, so they don't have to know the tricks that you might need to know to write such a complicated path that has so much potential to break. So so far there is nothing related to pins. So what is related to pin is the very simple idea of basically telling the package pins where to look for objects and then reading the object. So that's the whole meetup is about that. So pins has this idea of a board, a concept of a board, which is, you think of it as a folder, and you have to tell pins where that is. So it has a function called board folder, and you have to give it a path to tell it exactly where to locate that folder. And because this path is so difficult to type, that's why I use this function. So just I'm gonna pass pins path, and with that now the board has been created. So if I print the object board, it's simply some metadata that pins knows about to look for things. And here we already have a little description which says the path to that place in my computer, which is of course in sync to the Dropbox online, and then in sync with your own computers locally. And it contains 2 different objects. One is called EP Agricultural Livestock, and the other one is called ESA SME. So this is all you need to do on your end. So you first use the package with library pins, and then you create the board, giving it the path to where that folder is. And then the next thing you would do is just to read the pin. And this kind of demonstrates the new interface for pins, where the first argument is the board, meaning that we can pipe that into the function pin read. So before pin used a function called pin or pin get. Now those functions in the new interface are called different things. So now it's pin read to read data from a pin board. And yes, you can use the board explicitly here, but the pipe makes it very readable, so I'm going to use it. Then the second argument is name. So usually, because it's such a common argument, we won't use it explicitly. We just use the value that we want to pass to name, ESA SME. Say that I want to read that particular pin, right? So I ran that code, and that here it is, the data set that is behind that name. As simple as that. So pretty much, if you walk away from this meetup with that, you already achieved a lot. But then you may wonder, okay, how do I even know that is an option? And one is, as I showed before, if you just bring the name of the board, then you would see a very short summary of what you have there. But there is also a few other functions, and they are all in the new interface. They are all using as a first argument board. So that's how you always kind of start doing anything on pins. You just start with a board that contains what you're looking for. And there is this very nice function pin list, which will give you a list, basically extracting this piece that we saw on the board. Now you know which options are available to you, which data sets are available to you. But then, as I said before, it is possible to create different versions of a specific pin. So let's do that. So if I have a board, then I can query for the versions with pin version. As you can see, the new interface is pretty structured, pretty systematic. Always start with the board, then type pin underscore something, and let the autocomplete inspire you in what you want to do. So if I type there, I already see that there's a few things that I can do with versions. The one that I want to see is just to list versions. But if you choose to know more about pins later, I could be talking also about pin version delete, pin version prune, but those are functions we are not going to be covering today. Now you have to be a bit more specific. You have to say the name, the second argument, of the pin that you want to know something about the versions that you want to see. So in this case, let's say ESA SME. So if I want to see the versions of that dataset, here they are. You can think of it, so here you can already recognize that some pins have been created at different points in time. These points in time were all very close to each other because I've been preparing this as a demo for today, but you can think that in real life, I would be, for example, publishing a new pin every week or every month or whenever there is an update to the data. So you would be able to filter this data set as you would normally do with tools from, for example, the tidyverse package, just to get the specific version, say this one here, that you want. For convenience, I'm gonna rerun this code here. I'm gonna assign the result of that to an object called versions, because now it's a data set that is kind of easier to work with. So let's use tidyverse here to manipulate this a little bit. So if I query versions and say that I want to get the third version here, so this one here, instead of typing the whole thing, I could do something like versions, and then slice the third row. That will give me just that one row. And then I could pull just the values of version. So that gives me the string that I want. So let me clear that up, go with the arrow up to get the code that I want, and now the specific version that I'm interested in, I'm gonna store it in the object version. So version now contains just a piece of text that I can use inside a number of functions in the pins package to know more about that. So for example, here I can do, as usual with pins, board, pipe, pin underscore something. So meta, for example, gives me, if I give it the name, ESA SME, I can say, okay, the version, it's the specific version that I'm interested in, right? So the one that is stored in the object version. So that one will give me the metadata associated to this file, where I can see, okay, so this is V1, for example, in the title, and it says a little description of what that data set is. So this is all information that someone like me who develops the data set would be including in the metadata for the reader to know more about that data and decide if they want that data or something else. So another thing that you would might want to do is to once you know the version, instead of just knowing about the metadata, you may just read it, but you're reading the specific version, right? So whatever came with that specific version. So the name is the same, ESA underscore SME, but the dataset might have changed. It might have had maybe different columns, maybe different names for the same columns, and you as an analyst want your code to be stable, so you could probably read for each analysis a very specific version. You put it at the top of your file, and you make sure that every time you run that code will run successfully, regardless of what it is, the latest version of that data set. You could be using one specific version for one specific analysis. So this is what we have just covered, and that's about it. So this is a good place to stop for questions and answers. And then if there is time, I'm going to show you how I created that, how I published the data, which is very simple too and short. So let's go back to your faces. Let's see if someone has anything to say. CJ, please go ahead.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, when you save these versions, does it do some sort of diff of them to reduce the size, or does it like inflate the size, like duplicate it, or you know what I mean?
Yes, thanks, CJ. Yeah, just like you, I was interested in seeing the internal structure of that thing. So remember that with pins path, this is a little custom helper that I built. I can access the directory where I have all that. So let's see what is the tree of that, FS tree of that path. So basically to see what's the content. And as you suggest, there is totally duplicated data. You can choose the argument type for specifying the type of object that you want to save. For example, in this case, I'm using the QS format, which is quick serialization and comes from the QS package. It's pretty clever in that it's fast and compressed, but yes, I think two versions of a data set might even duplicate the size. So it is not probably the most size efficient way to share data. And this is on top of any version control that you might want to do, right? So you at the same time that you're creating versions with this kind of hash type of thing, you may also be hosting this as a developer in a Git repository, meaning that you could see the evolution of that. Let me go back to your faces. Yes, CJ, go ahead, please.
So then to follow from that, you said you can use different types. So like, is it any type or whatever? And then also like, why did you choose or prefer this QS type that I've never heard of? And also like, what are the features of this QS type? Does it save like column types? Can it say something besides the data frame?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in general, pins are designed to, the package pins is designed to store objects in general. And QS is simply one way of saving objects in R that is very similar to RDS. So this might be a little jargon for those who are not so close to the kind of coding side of things, but RDS is one way in which you can save objects of any type. And quick serialization is a package that's the same. So it's basically another flavor of RDS. The reason that I learned about it is because it has been advertised by this package. I didn't know much about it. I didn't know about it before. So I thought, let's see how it works. And I did find that was faster and more compressed than RDS, which is what says here. So I liked it, I tried it, and I'm trying it for real in a big project, and it's working just fine. So I'm kind of liking it. Any other format here, I think, is supported. And I'm not sure if there is plans, including Arrow, which is new and very powerful. I'm not sure about the plans for expansion to these types. And there is something that I'm not going to be covering here today, but some objects that I know from what I read here very quickly, some objects might not be supported by pins, and there is still a way to read and write them. So basically pins, you could use pins to store things that pins doesn't understand in a native way, just as any random file that you might be able to write. And then pins will give you still the ability of cache and all of that, but output just a path basically. And then you handle that path by reading it with whatever tool you need to read that very weird, imagine, format. Let's go back to your faces here. I think this actually brings me to two big features of pins that were considered when designing pins. And this, I'm just paraphrasing what I read in the health file, so that I've showed recently. So the very first goal of pins is to make data easy to share, right? But then there is a second kind of side effect, if you want, or a second goal, which is second to the ability of sharing things, that is the cache. The idea of saving data somewhere in your computer that you don't have to specify explicitly. Cache in computers are quite consensus, so there are some directories that each operative system, like Mac, Windows, Linux, define as, okay, this is the place where you should save cached object. And that's great because that means that you can say something like, okay, pins, just save this wherever and pins knows in my computer as much as it knows in your computer. So that releases me from having to write any code that handles paths. Something like I don't have to write code saying read from this specific place. Just save in cache and pins will know. And that's huge. It doesn't seem like a lot, but at 2 degrees we know that that's huge, because things come from very odd places, and sometimes a lot of our code is just handling paths, and a lot of our code breaks precisely because of that. So the more we minimize the surface for bugs, the more we can focus on the actual things that we care about in our code. All right, then we still have a few minutes. I would like to maybe show very briefly, how you actually create pins. I think that by now that might be even intuitive, because you already learned about the very consistent new API, which is this idea of board, pipe, pin underscore something. So I show you read, for example, and then all you need to know is that it's write, right? So with this function is the one that you use to create. To publish pins inside a board. So I have this file here, which is the one that I used to create the pins that I'm showing you here. So let's just walk through the printed code. So thanks, Jackson, for being patient. I realized that you noted that I already opened the floor for questions and you didn't interrupt, so thanks for that. So this is how you publish pins. So actually I could expand this more because I'm not gonna type any code. I'm here using the pins package, of course. The source of the data that I'm gonna be publishing comes from a package called passtags.data. And I use the package here to create portable paths. I'm using the same function that I showed you before to create a very difficult to type path to our Dropbox folder. I create the board in the same way that you create it when you want to read a pin, the same thing you do when you want to write it. And then there is this function pin write, which has a bunch of arguments, including arguments that allow you to specify, as I mentioned before, CJ, the type of object that you want to save. If you don't specify it, it will be RDS by default. And then some metadata that, again, is optional. Something I think could be typed here automatically if you don't do it explicitly. Something like, the size of the object, how many rows, or things like that. But then, the more you spend time thinking about what's useful information to share, I think the more usable is going to be that data set. And then if what you want to share with your colleagues is beyond the arguments, like something that doesn't fit in title and doesn't fit in description, you can always give arbitrary metadata in a list passed to metadata. So for example, here I use this argument to pass the URL where the original data comes from. And you can specify version to say, okay, turn on or off the versions. So here I'm advertising that pins can help us share different versions without our analysts knowing much about, for example, Git. But also know that you can turn it off, and then the objects won't grow as you resave them. So with version off, what you can do is just override continuously the objects that you create and share always the latest and greatest, and then leave it to your version control system, the one we use, Git, to give to it, to that specific tool, the powers of going back in time, which is totally doable, right? So either you choose the feature version from pins or you use version control. But then version control is maybe the tool that is kind of closer to the development side of things, and maybe not a tool that is very intuitive for everyone else. So here I did the same thing a second time for like the version 2 of this data set. The only thing it changes in this code is the string that says that this is version 2, version 1 and version 2. And then I did the same thing for a different object. So here I'm saving, note how I'm saving or writing a pin with this data set, EP, agriculture and livestock. And here at the top, I was handling a different data set, the ESA SME. So here I'm just reusing data from a package, but in real life, you would be doing a ton of manipulations maybe to create the data that you want to share. And that's all. And then, you may have noted that pins tells you if you are creating a new version of a pin, or if you are replacing the version that you had before. And you can set something that we might talk about that in an extended version of this series if you want, otherwise we won't. But you can say that you want the version feature for a specific pin or for the entire pin board. That's something that pins allows you to do. Okay, back to your little faces. Let's see if there's any last comment or question. Okay, last thing I want to say is thank you. I'm very proud that we finished on time today. And I'm advertising this poll on Slack on the coding channel for the next DS Incubator series. I thank you for having been very patient up to this point in April 5. I haven't this year asked for feedback about the meetups because I have had like some things that were kind of burning to actually do work with the Pastax team. I wanted to share information that we needed, but now I'm opening the series for vote. So feel free to go to the coding channel, find this post, and add your vote about which topic you would like us to talk about starting next meetup. And one of the options is an extended version of this meetup where you would see more the development side of things of Bits. But so far we are more interested in learning the general aspects of Unix to unleash the power of your terminal. Okay, thank you all very much. I see you next time.
Wow.
Ciao, ciao.